Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to kick the hornet's nest. Not because I'm someone who likes punishment, or maybe I am, but maybe because it's Ash Wednesday as I'm recording this, and Lent is about suffering in order to grow in holiness. The other day I did a video on modesty, and the video is called The Conspiracy Against Modesty, How Catholics Should Dress. And I went over the plan of the Masons and stuff to, corrupt fashions and how the popes talked about it, and I went through the virtues and all those sorts of things. And this video has been very, very well received. I didn't touch on women wearing dresses versus pants in a very specific way, although I did talk about it, but I sort of talked about the generalities of what modesty is, both in dress and behavior, according to Aquinas and all that. Video has been well received, but as I thought, there has been this ongoing conversation in the various comment sections of the places that I've posted this video about pants. And the issue of women wearing pants versus dresses and stuff has sparked a pretty fiery conversation between people. I'm not going to tell you how you're supposed to dress. I'm just going to present in this video when women started wearing pants, why they were promoted, and the reasons why are pretty shocking. And you can do with that information what you will. Stay tuned. Before we get into the meat of the video, a few things to consider. No, a particular piece of clothing is not intrinsically evil. That's basically impossible to say. Even a particularly revealing piece of clothing itself isn't intrinsically evil, and in a certain circumstance, like in the privacy of one's home or as an undergarment, etc., obviously those things would be fine. Medical settings, whatever. Intrinsic evil's really hard to prove with most things. Things that exist are good. Things that are created are good. For example, the coca leaf that we get cocaine from is good. There's nothing intrinsically evil about it. It has a purpose. It can be used for medicine. And in fact, refined versions of it are used, which are basically cocaine in things like dental and eye surgeries. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with that. The same with opium. Opium is used as a painkiller, which is necessary in many cases for some pretty complex surgeries and pain management, for healing from surgeries, which is super important to have pain management to heal from them. But of course, there's an addictive side to it. It's how we use things that makes them used badly, and then that action itself is sinful. It's an instrument as part of our sinful use of a thing. Someone can have a surgery and have a particular pain medication, and it's used for a particular amount of time, and that makes a lot of sense. But then starting to pop a bunch of Oxycontins and Percocets every day because you want to have a warm feeling and a fun ride through life and basically be stoned all the time, well, now we're going to be committing the sin of intoxication. So we have to get past this idea of, well, something's not technically intrinsically evil, therefore it's fine that I do it. Well, how we do it, why we do it, who we do it around, and all those sorts of things, they make all the difference in the world. When it comes to modesty, we're talking about virtues. Virtues are perfections. We have to do virtuous things. We can't just say, well, I'm not sinning, technically speaking, therefore it's fine. That's not really how it works. So with that in mind, let's talk about this. And again, you can do with the information what you will, and that's totally up to you. Now, before we continue, I do want to make it known that I am going to the Holy Land later this year on a pilgrimage with a traditional priest of the Society of St. Pius X, and this is done by Catholic Heritage Tours. You can go to kennedyhall.ca/holyland. The link for that is in the description, and you go there and it brings you right to the information page. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, Mount Tabor, Cana, Sea of Galilee, Mount Carmel, and more. We're going to be seeing all the places. It's a very active trip, so if you're someone who is not in good physical condition, meaning at least you can't kind of walk all day, you're going to have to train for it, which means basically training by walking. The trip is going to be in the fall, so unless you're in the southern hemisphere, you're going to have your nice weather from here to there, which gives you a lot of time to get in shape. The Italy trip that we went on with the group last November was listed as moderate, and I have one of these watches, these Garmin watches that tracks your steps and stuff, and we were doing about 8 miles a day, 15,000 steps, And this is supposedly more active than that, so keep that into consideration. But it's going to be an amazing trip. So click the link underneath for the Holy Land trip pilgrimage if you are interested, or go to kennedyhall.ca/holy-land. If you just go to kennedyhall.ca, everything is linked at the top. It's very easy to find. All right. So let's talk about the history of women wearing pants. Here's the thing, my friends. Women are never recorded as wearing pants, especially in Christendom, until about 150 years ago. And even there, it was pretty rare. And the origins of why it took place are really strange and kind of alarming. I've put a document together of research, and I'm going to share that with you so we can go through that so I don't make any mistakes. So here is the document. And okay, so women wearing trousers as opposed to dresses and skirts started gaining traction in Western society around the mid-19th century, though it was rare and often tied to specific context. So these are the earliest examples. The earliest notable instances were practical rather than fashionable. For example, during the 1840s and 1850s in the United States, some women in utopian communities like the Oneida Colony, or followers of the women's rights movement, like Amelia Bloomer, experimented with bloomers, which were loose trousers, paired with a short skirt. These were meant for functionality, not style, and were met with ridicule or scandal by mainstream society. Bloomer herself abandoned the style due to the backlash, though she kept advocating for dress reform. Now, a couple key things here to take into consideration, the key words being the women's rights movements. That's a code word for feminism. Even if you look at if you actually look into the works of these women rights advocates, on the surface, many of the things seem great. And granted, a lot of this did arise in Protestant societies, and Protestant societies have struggled with, like America, and they have struggled with, no virtue. So in some cases, you find that these were tied to things like temperance, meaning not drinking. But that's not really what temperance is. Temperance means being able to enjoy alcohol without getting drunk. But the sort of teetotalism, Puritanism had influenced this movement in the United States. And objectively so, many of the men devolved into alcoholism. And these are the reasons why America for a time adopted prohibition. But it's a disordered reaction, this whole temperance thing, because, it's based on a Puritan religious philosophy where there's no such thing as sanctifying grace. And in a society like that, you have this confusion and this caricature of things like gender roles. And the women were reacting to that, and it's understandable that they were, but they adopted a lot of weird ideas that became feminism. So they wanted reforms of marriage. They wanted things like divorce. They wanted things like birth control. All of this was happening in the late 1800s and mid 1800s. And it was these women like this Bloomer person who were pushing reforms in dress. Because you have to understand, the idea is that men had all the privileges in society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, the solution to that was basically to be like men. That was at the heart of the suffrage movement as well. In fact, if you look around, you can even find funny pictures of women advocating for voting rights for women, and they were wearing pants as a way of showing that they're just like men. And this is where we get the expression, she wears the pants. It was this idea that the roles in marriage were reversed. That is not something that as Catholics that we can support. The scriptures are extremely clear about the headship of the man in the home and the head of the family, the head of the wife. And wanting to flip those things on its head, even if there are seemingly decent motivations for doing it, is not something that is acceptable to a Catholic. So, for example, here is an image of a suffragette showing off her pants on her way to do the protesting thing. And she was basically just adopting the fashion of men in order to say, look at me, I'm a man, I have the rights of man. And again, one can criticize the strange problems that were going on. And I'm not here to advocate for a Protestant Puritan society. I'm a Catholic and I'm not going to support that. But the reaction was a feminist reaction. There are other examples that we can find if we look. I have a couple pictures here that I want to show you. This was one of the, things that came out. Where is it? There we go. And you can see here, these are various, pictures from that time. And this is the pantalette suffragette. So I'm going to wear this, and I'm going to combine male and female clothing. I have the woman up top, the party. That's kind of like the mullet, but it's clothing. It's like party in the back, business in the front. I have the woman up the top, and I have the man at the bottom. This is a caricature of, how the clerical class was so whatever, blah, blah, blah. So here I am. I'm going to go show the priest that I am, a modern woman, and I wear pants, and I'm not like these, whatever, and I'm going to buck your social trends, da-da-da-da-da. This was what was behind it. Again, you want to say that there were problems, whatever. But even the idea of universal suffrage, this idea is not based in Catholic morality either. It's not even clear that democracy itself is good. It's not clear that every man should be voting. It's not clear that any of us should really be voting about much. I mean, look what it's gotten us. Democracy kind of sucks. But the point is that the origins of this original movement towards pants had to do with these social movements, which was hell-bent, pun intended, on overturning society and changing it into something that was unrecognizable and was not based in the Christian moral tradition. Now, another thing that was mentioned in that brief history I read before was the Oneida Community. I highlighted it here. It was women in the utopian Oneida Community started wearing pants, and they were tied to women's rights. So we need to consider what that community was, and it's very shocking. Funny enough, though, if you have silverware, like the Oneida silverware or whatever, that's still from there because they made silverware. It was like this weird industrial cult. But anyway, the Oneida Community. So the Oneida Community was a utopian religious commune founded in 1848 in Oneida, New York by John Humphrey Noyes, who was one of these gurus who started these cults. It aimed to live out a radical interpretation of Christianity based on Noyes' theology of perfectionism, the belief that human beings could achieve sinless perfection on earth through faith and communal living. So this was basically, like the heresy of Jansenism. The group rejected traditional societal norms in favor of their own system, which they saw as a path to spiritual and social harmony. At its core, the Oneida Community practiced what was called Bible communism, meaning they shared all property and resources. They abolished traditional marriage in favor of complex marriage, where every man and every woman in the community were considered married to each other, so some weird form of orgiastic polygamy. Monogamy was discouraged. Instead, members engaged in sexual relationships with multiple partners, but these were regulated by the community, often with Noyes himself approving the pairings. They also practice male continence, a form of birth control where men were expected to withhold, etc., during, etc. Anyway, it's just weird stuff. Economically, they were self-sufficient and entrepreneurial. They ran several businesses, most famously producing silverware. The Oneida brand of flatware still exists today as a legacy of their work. They also made animal traps and silk thread. Everyone worked, and roles weren't strictly divided by men or women. Women often took on traditionally male tasks, which is part of why some adopted trousers or bloomers. Socially, the community was tight-knit but hierarchical. One of the most disturbing parts was that they basically practiced this thing called mutual criticism, where members would publicly critique each other's flaws to foster personal growth. So it was public shaming. And the children were raised communally, not by their biological parents, to break what Noyes saw as selfish family attachments. So this is a weird extreme thing. This is the modern world. This little cult is the modern industrialized world. Birth control, multiple partners, fornication, promiscuity, men and women changing roles, children being raised by the state, public school, etc. This is what this is. This is where they first in America started to wear pants. And the reason is because we're no longer men and women in different roles. We just do each other's things, and we just are basically almost transgender in a sense. It was like this, weird gender-bending thing. And that's where women first started to wear pants. So that's information that is just factual, and That's the origin of much of it. We'll continue, though. In Europe, women like George Sand, a French novelist, wore trousers as early as the 1830s, but this was more of an act of defiance and tied to her bohemian persona than a trend. So the bohemians started wearing, I forgot to show that, by the way. The bohemians started wearing pants. Okay, a little bit about bohemianism. Bohemians typically rejected conventional career paths, and they chose alternative ways. They prioritized individuality and self-expression, which showed up in their clothing, which was deliberately eclectic and unkempt, which means sloppy and slobbish, in their living spaces, which were a disaster, and in their social habits, late-night debates in cafes, heavy drinking, and drug use. Sexual freedom was also a hallmark. Monogamy and traditional marriage were scorned in favor of open relationships or serial romances, etc. They leaned towards political radicalism, supporting things like socialism or anarchism. And their rebellion was more often cultural than institutional. They basically wanted to buck the status quo and, screw the rich and all that kind of stuff. And they attacked the taboo themes in their society and promoted sexual decadence and whatnot. I mean, this is just like your classic, Occupy Wall Street, socialist community, whatever. And it was all about doing what you want and communal living and being a slob and doing drugs and whatever. Okay, obviously, mainstream historians are going to remember them as being heroes because of their art and whatever, and mainstream history hates traditional civilization, so that's not a surprise. But this is where the pants trend became more common in Europe. So in America, the pants trend was tied to feminism, women's rights, like suffragette sort of thing, and weird cult living that was kind of, open fornication, transgender strangeness, where children were raised by committees. And in Europe, it was basically tied to a degenerate lifestyle. And this is kind of in keeping with, if you watch my video on modesty from a week ago or so, the thing about modesty is that it reflects the inside, okay? And I go through this at length in that video. So if you want to know about modesty at length, there's lots in there. It's like almost an hour long, and I go through tons of stuff from Aquinas and whatnot. Modesty is the exterior presentation of your interior life, basically. This is why we have modesty in speech, and as well as modesty in dress and so forth. And decorum is tightly linked to modesty, so kind of how you behave. If somebody has bad manners, you might say he has no decorum. And how we take care of our houses, whether outside or inside, is it clean? Is it decorated nicely? It doesn't have to be super fancy, but does it have an order to it? Is the lawn cut? If you drive by a house and they've got a lawn the size, 3 feet tall, it's like there's probably a pretty sketchy house in there. And that's just, we all know that. The same thing in personal life. If somebody presents themselves very slobbishly, very scandalously, obviously they're not going to have morals, right? That they just wouldn't do that. You just don't do that, right? And how we adopt various fashions says a lot about what we believe about morals. It just does. Now, again, we live in a society where most of us have inherited these modern fashions. And I understand that's very different than somebody 150 years ago actively working in defiance against what was always understood. But it's still the same legacy. And those are just the historical facts that we have to wrestle with. If you were to consider, for example, modesty in relation to women's dress. And by the way, there were some pictures I found, because I'm going to talk about this thing from Coco Chanel in a little bit in the video, from the 1930s. It was called the beach pajamas, and that was another version of pants sort of becoming mainstream for women. The funny thing is I can't actually show the pictures, because I found the pictures, and they're very immodest, beachwear stuff. The men are wearing suits, walking with the women who are dressed scandalously. And this is in keeping with what I showed in my last video about the about Modesty, about the plot by the various Masonic groups where they wanted to corrupt the women because that would ultimately corrupt the men. And there's another link there to this corruption. And it was very interesting to see women walking on the beach wearing these scandalous outfits with men dressed in full suits because they hadn't changed their fashions yet, where the women were changing theirs. And then sort of this is part of that culture of iniquity and fornication and so forth. And then this corrupts everything. And now men don't even wear suits anymore, or just don't even dress well at all. You don't have to wear a suit, but that's just an example. I'm wearing a t-shirt and a quarter zip because I'm sitting here in my cold basement and doing my podcast. But the point is that we see this degradation. And now we're at the point where, men dress ridiculously. I mean, what's with this trend of men? They wear these tiny shorts all the time. It's so weird. Men wear shorts all the time. It's really gay. And they basically dress the same as the women now. It's very androgynous. And it's everywhere, anyway, this is a result of all that stuff. So when we consider this clothing stuff, it's not just an afterthought. It doesn't come out of nowhere. And the way that we dress is going to affect what we believe about morals. It's kind of like the expression, you are what you eat, in many ways, kind of you are what you wear, And there's a little play there, but there's some principles we have to consider. All right, let's go back to this historical sketch. So that was the Bohemian background. But now there was another resurgence because at that time, the whole women wearing pants thing was pretty much tied to weird, extreme, fringy, degenerate things. It starts to become mainstream in the war period. So trousers as everyday wear for women didn't really take off until the 20th century. World War I was a turning point with men at the front, women working in factories, farms, and other labor-intensive jobs started wearing trousers for safety and practicality. Photos from the era show women in overalls or loose pants, though they often reverted back to skirts outside work. The 1920s and 30s saw trousers creep into fashion like Coco Chanel's, and Coco Chanel was a drug addict, wide-leg beach pajamas, or Marlene Dietrich rocking a tuxedo in 1930s Hollywood, but these were still avant-garde, not mainstream. Most women stuck to skirts for daily wear. Trousers were seen as bold or even subversive. It wasn't until World War II that trousers became more normalized. Again, women in war-related jobs, think of Rosie the Riveter, that classic image, wore them widely. Post-war, the trend stuck around, especially with the rise of casual wear in the 1950s and 60s. The 1970s, trousers were a standard part of women's wardrobes in many Western countries due to changing social norms. And designers like Yves Saint Laurent popularizing styles like the smoking suit. This was the classic smoking suit from like 1967. My friends, this is a woman dressed like a man. This is what it is. And this was seen as, I'm smoking like a man, I'm dressing like a man, I'm standing like a man, I'm one of the boys. Women wearing pants was always about women being like boys. It's not feminine. It just isn't. You can dislike what I'm saying, but that is the historical sketch. Now, some interesting things to consider here. This reality that it starts with the war period, I think is fascinating because what we're talking about here is women being ripped away from their traditional roles in a healthy society of the family unit, men being sent off to these immoral conflicts where there was really, let's not get into that, but those were disastrous things. They were tragedies. And adopting male roles in these factory settings. And in these factory settings, there's a utility as to why men would not be wearing flowy clothing because they get caught in the machines and things like that. Funny enough, even men prior to the Industrial Revolution wore a lot more shawls and even like tunic type stuff. That was pretty common for a long time. Trousers for men didn't become the norm until much more recently than people probably understand. Even for things like riding in horses and stuff, you didn't have to wear pants to do that. You might, but you didn't have to. There were flowy shawls and robes and whatever. So it's with this industrialization of society, which really was in many ways a disaster for the family unit because it takes men away from the family home business. It mechanizes farms and Therefore, less people are agrarian and they move into the cities, and in the cities, iniquity abounds. This is like the whole reason why like the Dickensian literature exists. Charles Dickens talking about sort of the rot of early 1800s England, which was experiencing that. So these trends were tied to social decay. And the women were forced into this setting where men were a part of this social decay because of the radical change in lifestyle. And they were having to adopt these male roles. They had enough sense when the men came back from World War I to not take that as a thing that they would adopt forever. But the societal trends just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And as society experiences its major revolutions in the 1960s, the sexual revolution and so forth, these trends stick. These trends that were born in feminism, these trends that were born in weird cults, these trends that were born in some type of transgender mentality, these trends that were born in this very strange, esoteric, avant-garde fashion, which was all tied to opium use and all this crazy stuff going on with the fashionistas. These trends that were tied to this push to, advocate for and encourage fornication and whatnot in society. After World War II, come the revolutions in morals officially, and boom, now we adopt these things for men and women. But the origins are still the same. It's not consistent with anything in Catholic history. It's just not there. You can take that information and do what you want with it, but that's what it is. And there are, I guess I should go with the conclusion here, but there are a lot of myths about stuff that we should talk about, and I'll just say that in the conclusion here. So, pants for women have their origin in feminism, weird cults, industrialism, and modern immodest fashions, and are not seen until decadent and anti-family modernity arrives. Women have worn dresses and skirts for basically all of history in some fashion, and they gardened, worked, rode animals, farmed, raised children, etc. Their clothing never, quote-unquote, got in the way. One of the things that we always hear is, well, I could never wear pants all the time. I could never wear dresses all the time because I got to do this. And I'm like, okay, first of all, have you ever seen the Mennonites? I'm not saying go be a Mennonite, but they do it all the time. And I'm not saying dress like them. I'm just saying it's not an argument against wearing dresses because they do all. I mean, certainly if the Mennonites women are wearing dresses every day and skirts, and they're very practical and functional, it's not like Sunday best, but they're wearing dresses and stuff every day. I think that with your office job where you sit at a computer, I don't think the dress is going to get in the way. Call me crazy. I don't think it's going to get in the way of the homeschooling. I don't think it's going to get in the way of going to the grocery store. I don't think it's going to get in the way of anything. I mean, I can't exercise. I have to wear pants for exercise. Does your exercise involve movements that are any more complex and demanding than like farm labor? Probably not. I mean, we go to the gym to basically mimic what we do in farm labor. We bend down and we pick things up and we push them above our heads and we pull them up to our chest and whatever. I mean, that's what we do. Also, have you ever heard of nuns? They wear habits all day. And they garden and they clean and they study and they teach and they cook and they sew. Heck, there were nurses. That's where the old nursing uniforms, they were nuns. They had no problem like working as nurses. This idea that the clothing just gets in the way, it's not practical, it's not even true. I mean, what the heck are we supposed to do with all of human history that shows us the contrary? There's a video I want to just show you here to end. I'm not going to play it, but I just want you to see it. And I put the link there in my thing. I'll just click that. Hold on. So I'll recommend this video. This is a video, and again, this is like someone doing a reenactment thing. By no means am I saying you ought to go dressed like this Revolutionary War era performer. But this video is very interesting. I found this a few years ago. This woman basically dresses, she has to dress this way for her job. She basically works at one of these, historical sites. So she said, I wore 18th century clothing for every day for 5 years. And this is what I learned. Again, you should go watch it yourself. What's very fascinating about this, and again, I'm not saying this is the fashion you should adopt. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is she learned a lot about how modern clothing was very anti-woman and traditional clothing was very pro-woman. And what she learned was, like, women fluctuate in weight a lot based on hormones and water retention, which has everything to do with their female cycles and so forth. We all know about that. Some of us know about that more than others. And the clothing that was always made before had natural give and take for things like pregnancy and things like the various changes that women go through, winter weight, all these things to do with climate. And it was pieces of clothing that were adaptable to all circumstances. Also, the clothing had a hygienic purpose, which was much more hygienic than what is offered today. I won't go into that in detail because that's maybe not my place to talk about here, but she does talk about that as a woman, and it's very interesting to hear her say that. She talked about how the way that she dressed actually had her act in different ways with more elegance, and she found out that the men around her would act in different ways based on the way that she was presenting herself, and she thought it was amazing. This isn't some crazy trad Catholic or whatever in this video. Not that I don't love me some trad Catholics, but she's just a woman who did this as a job and just kind of did this experiment, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating what she discovered. And one of the things that I found that was interesting is because she also talks about the men that she worked with who took on a similar experiment to dressing like the men did at the time. And one of the things that they just found they could never do is they just couldn't overeat because the clothing fit properly to their bodies based on the tailoring, and being overly full just was something that they didn't want to do because it was so uncomfortable. They couldn't just slouch over. There were just so many benefits to the way people dressed. Again, I'm not going to adopt wearing the 18th century clothing. I'm not even saying that's the proper one we should wear. I'm just saying this is an example. Anyway, I find it fascinating, and it's worth checking out. So I'll put the link for that video underneath as well if you want to see it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you're upset at what I've said, I'm just presenting you information. You can do with that information what you want. And that's all I really have to say. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I got. This has been Mere Tradition. Until next time, God bless you all. Bye-bye.